Bonjour! Today's video is kindly sponsored by Babbel, the world's #1 language learning app. Hey, 42 here. On the 22nd of August 1922, police were called to a disturbance at a house in Los Angeles after neighbors reported hearing gunshots. The lady of the house, the wonderfully named Volberger Oosterreich, Dolly to her friends, screaming hysterically. Officers arrived to a grisly scene. Lying in a slowly spreading pool of blood on the living room floor was Dolly's husband, Fred Oosterreich. A persistent banging coming from the master bedroom upstairs led the police to Dolly herself, who'd been locked inside a large wardrobe. Once free of this unusual prison, a sobbing Dolly explained what had happened. An armed stranger had broken into the house, demanding that she and her husband hand over their valuables. Fred had refused to comply, and the intruder had eloquently articulated his unwillingness to discuss the matter further by shooting Fred 3 times at point-blank range, before bundling Dolly into the wardrobe. A quick search of the house revealed that Fred's prized possession, a diamond-encrusted watch, had been stolen. From what I've told you so far, this probably sounds like a million other robberies gone wrong that appear on the news on a weekly basis. But there's more to this case than meets the eye. Like, a lot more. And believe me, you're really going to struggle to guess who done it in this one. Despite her story, Dolly soon found herself at the heart of a fledgling murder investigation. After all, there were no other suspects on hand, and it was well known that she and Fred had a volatile relationship. Several neighbors claimed to have heard the couple arguing on that night in question. It also appeared that Fred had been killed with a .25 caliber pistol, which was considered a lady's firearm, and not the kind of weapon you'd expect an armed robber to favour. But whilst the police suspected Dolly may have been behind her husband's murder, there was one major problem with their case. If Dolly had shot and killed Fred, how had she ended up locked inside the wardrobe? As it happens, the police were right to suspect Dolly was hiding something, though it's safe to say that never in a million years could they have guessed what that something was. With over 10 million subscribers worldwide and content updated daily, Babbel is top of the list for anyone wanting to learn a new language. And it's easy to see why. Personally, I want to know my baguettes for my brioche, my mere for my grand mere, and my soleil for my soirée. I want to be able to travel in France and have at least a basic conversation with the locals without scratching my head in embarrassment. So, I'm using Babbel to learn to speak French. Babbel is packed full of great learning content, and it's all designed by real-life language experts in order to get you learning with real-life situations and dialogue. It offers 10-minute lessons that are proven to get you speaking in a new language in just 3 weeks. And did you know that Babbel also has podcasts, stories, and games to completely submerge yourself into the language of your choice? Babbel is great because it works. But don't just take my word for it. University studies have actually shown that just 15 hours of Babbel are equivalent to a full semester of college Spanish. So, if you're looking to become bilingual for professional or personal reasons, or you just feel like learning a new language would be a great achievement for you, then I would highly recommend giving Babbel a try. If you sign up to Babbel today, you can get 65% off. That's less than $5 a month to learn a language. So don't miss out and click the link in the description below. Au revoir et bonne chance. To understand how this murder came about, we need to take a look at the events leading up to it. Because the seeds of this crime were planted a good 9 years before it actually took place. Back then, Fred and Dolly had been living in Milwaukee, where Fred owned a successful textiles factory. On the outside, they had the perfect life. There was plenty of money, they lived in a nice house, and with business at the factory booming, their future together seemed bright. There was only one problem. Fred Oosterreich was beginning to suspect he was losing his mind. He'd started to become forgetful, regularly misplacing things like clothes and his favourite cigars. He was hearing things too, scratching, scuffling sounds that seemed to come from the roof. He'd have put the noises down to mice, Only Dolly never seemed to hear them. Fred went to see his physician and was given the all-too-predictable diagnosis that the stress of his high-profile job was beginning to get to him. The doctor prescribed him some good old-fashioned R&R, but Fred had already discovered a far better medicine: alcohol. Not that it helped, in fact it only seemed to make things worse. Fred began to sense a sort of presence in his house. He'd catch glimpses of movement at the corners of his eyes, and once or twice he awoke in the night, swearing a ghostly figure had been standing over him just moments before. Fred lived with this growing paranoia for 5 years before deciding enough was enough. It was time to move, preferably as far away from Milwaukee as possible. In 1918, Fred and Dolly relocated to LA. Fred probably hoped the sunshine would chase away his demons, but sadly, it wasn't to be. Every single one of his symptoms continued in their new home, something that seemed to confirm Fred's worst fears. It hadn't been the house, it was him. He was losing his grip on reality. Fred descended further into drink, and his relationship with Dolly deteriorated rapidly. It wasn't helped by the fact he strongly suspected his wife was being unfaithful. But in truth, the tension between them had been building for years. And one night, the powder keg exploded. Fred and Dolly had a blazing row. Both were screaming and threats were made. The kind of threats that aren't easy to take back the next day. But as it happened, Fred would never get the chance, because just when it seemed a very dangerous line was about to be crossed, a man burst into the room, brandishing 2 small pistols. There was a brief scuffle, and in the confusion the intruder shot Fred at point-blank range 3 times, before collecting whatever valuables he could find, locking Dolly in a wardrobe upstairs, and making his escape. If you've been paying attention, you'll know that matches the story Dolly told the police pretty much exactly. But there were 2 small differences, and they changed everything. First of all, Fred had distinctly heard the intruder running downstairs before entering the living room where he and Dolly were arguing. If this was a burglar in search of an easy score, why did he run towards the homeowners when he simply could have collected the many valuables upstairs and left at his leisure? Even more interesting was the fact that Fred recognized the man who shot him. His name was Otto Sanhuber. He'd worked in Fred's factory in Milwaukee as a sewing machine repairman almost a decade earlier before quitting his job suddenly in 1913. Fred hadn't seen the man since. So, any ideas what the hell was going on here? Did Dolly hire an old acquaintance to bump off her husband? Might she have been microdosing Fred with poison to induce his fears of going insane? Or had she been telling the truth all along and the whole thing was just one really strange coincidence? Actually, none of those things. The truth was far more bizarre. Fred had been right to think Dolly was having an affair. Her lover, Otto Sanhuber, had been hiding upstairs at the time of the argument, and, fearing for Dolly's life, he'd taken her pistols from a drawer in the nightstand and rushed downstairs to her aid. There had been a scuffle, and after Fred was dead, Otto and Dolly quickly cooked up the intruder story. Otto then took Fred's diamond watch to make a robbery look more believable, before locking Dolly in the wardrobe to give her a cast iron alibi. But here's the thing. When I said Otto Sanhuber was hiding upstairs, I didn't mean he just happened to be there at the time of the argument. Otto Sanhuber was always hiding upstairs. Fred had been living with the man who would one day murder him for 9 whole years, without even knowing it. Dolly had first taken a liking to Otto after seeing him working in Fred's factory in 1913, And, keen to find an excuse to spend some time alone with him, she told Fred that their sewing machine was broken. As expected, Fred sent Otto round to fix it the very next day. In what might have been one of the earliest recorded examples of a now rather famous adult film trope, 17-year-old Otto turned up at the Oysterreich residence to find Dolly dressed in stockings, a silk gown, and not a lot else. At first, the affair carried on much like any other. Whenever Otto could get time off work, he'd turn up at Dolly's place to give her sewing machine an extremely thorough fixing. But the neighbours were beginning to put two and two together. Dolly knew Otto couldn't keep coming to the house without Fred finding out about the affair. And so, she came up with a plan. She was going to ask Otto to move in with her. That might seem like a logical step for a woman about to leave her husband for her bit on the side, but Dolly had absolutely no intention of divorcing Fred. Instead, she planned to have Otto move into her attic in secret so that he would always be on hand whenever her sewing machine needed fixing. This unusual little scheme did come with a few minor downsides from Otto's perspective, of course, namely that he would have to give up his job, his home, and all contact with the outside world. I can only assume Dolly had one hell of a nice sewing machine, because believe it or not, Otto agreed. From that moment on, he lived on his own in the Oysterreich's tiny attic. During the day, he would emerge from his lair to be with Dolly. When his skills weren't needed, Otto kept busy doing the housework. Fred would never know it, but it wasn't Dolly who ironed his clothes, made his bed, polished his shoes, and cooked his dinners. It was the man who'd been living in his house for years without him knowing. And if that doesn't creep you out, nothing will. As utterly bizarre as this arrangement was, it went on like this for a staggering 9 years. And remember, Fred and Dolly moved during that time. Thanks to some very careful planning on Dolly's part, Otto managed to move with them. After Fred's murder, Otto continued to live in Dolly's attic, including yet another house move, but his simple existence was about to come to an abrupt end. You see, Dolly wasn't doing such a great job of playing the grieving widow, not least because she'd started sleeping with the lawyer who'd handled her dead husband's estate, a man named Herman Shapiro. And it seems Dolly was pretty fond of old Herman, because after they'd been seeing each other for a few months, she decided to give him a gift. A rather nice diamond-encrusted watch. Yeah, not her finest moment, that. It wasn't long before the detectives investigating Fred's murder found out about Dolly's little gift, and they immediately connected it to Fred's supposedly stolen watch. If they'd been suspicious before, now they were certain Dolly had been involved in her husband's murder. She was duly arrested, and knowing she might be facing a long spell in jail, her thoughts naturally turned to the big man upstairs. Otto. Dolly worried her secret lover was going to starve. With nobody else to turn up, she asked her new boyfriend, Herman, to take a few supplies up to her attic, claiming she'd been letting her homeless brother stay there for a while. It was a flimsy lie, and when Herman opened the trapdoor to Otto's lair, it was exposed immediately. Remember, by this time, Otto hadn't spoken to another, other than Dolly, for 10 years. The idea that an actual human being could come to visit him sent Otto into overdrive. He thanked Herman for the food, then promptly spilled the beans about his affair with Dolly, Fred's murder, and his role in the house, which he described as part sex slave, part secret housekeeper. Luckily for Otto, not to mention Dolly, Herman didn't go to the police. He'd fallen for Dolly pretty hard, and he had no intention of seeing her end up in jail. Dolly would indeed escape a prison sentence. The judge threw out the trial based on a lack of evidence. But when she got home, Herman Shapiro made her an ultimatum. Either the man in the attic had to go, or he would. And so, after nearly a decade living in secret in Dolly's loft, in 1923, Otto Sandhuber was forced back out into the world. Over the following years, the investigation into Fred's murder went cold. But it was only a matter of time before Dolly slipped up again. And in 1930, she did exactly that, when she unceremoniously dumped Herman Shapiro, the one man alive aside from Otto Sandhuber who knew all her most dangerous secrets. Annoyed at being cast aside, Herman Shapiro marched straight into the nearest police station and told the first officer he could find everything he knew about his ex-partner, the man she'd kept hidden in the loft for a decade, and the crime they'd committed together. Otto and Dolly were duly arrested, and both were put on trial for Fred's murder. Otto, who since leaving Dolly had managed to get married to a woman who actually let him live in her house, confessed to having killed Fred. But his lawyer convinced a jury Otto had only been trying to protect Dolly from her violent husband. Otto was convicted, but of manslaughter, not murder. And since the statute of limitations had run out on that charge, he walked away from the trial a free man. Somehow, Dolly also walked away without punishment for her part in Fred's murder. Her trial ended with the jury unable to reach a decision as to her guilt. As you can probably imagine, the story of the man who lived in his lover's attic for almost a decade was a media sensation. Otto was dubbed the Batman of LA and the Ghost in the Garret. But his story has been largely forgotten in the years since, though it did inspire a truly terrible made-for-TV film starring a young Neil Patrick Harris. After the trials, Otto Sandhuber faded into obscurity, and Dolly Oesterreich finally settled down, living with her second husband until she died in the early 1960s. So far as we know, it was just the two of them this time. This is such an unusual tale, it's hard to know what to make of it. But if there's one thing I'd like you to take away from this video, it's this. The next time you hear a strange, scuffling noise coming from your attic, there's a good chance you don't have an annoying mouse infestation after all. It's probably just a person who lives in your house without you knowing about it. You're welcome. And thanks for watching. Good news, you can now pre-order my new book, Bread and Circuses. What did the Romans ever do for us? It's a wild and witty journey through 1,000 years of unexpected Roman history, told in a refreshing way and packed full of incredible and unbelievable stories. Copies are selling out fast, so pre-order yours today to lock it in. Thank you.